take their seats, we're going to get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for Fuel for Truth's 6-Day War event. My name is Jennifer Deckel, and I'm the president of Fuel for Truth's DC chapter. For those of you who aren't familiar with Fuel for Truth, or FFT, we are an Israel educational and empowerment organization designed to provide young professionals and community leaders with the tools to be effective and proactive advocates for Israel. Fuel for Truth was founded in New York following 9/11 by a group of young secular Jews who saw the connection between the mass murders of 9/11 and repeated terror attacks on Israel. To combat this threat to both Americans and the Jewish people, they passionately dedicated their considerable skills, financial resources, and time to promoting the truth about Israel and her war on radical Islamic terror. About a year and a half ago, Fuel for Truth was launched in Washington, D.C. by young professionals Daniel Flesch and myself. I am proud to say that we have since held 5 boot camp sessions, thanks to Daniel, FFT-DC's executive director, and of course, our amazing FFT-DC boot camp alumni, many of whom are in the room, which now comprise nearly 100 young professionals. FFT-DC alumni are truly what makes this organization what has it become today. FFT is centered around our boot camps, an 8-week course on Tuesday evenings in which we cover a range of topics from Israel's history to how to combat accusations against Israel. We bring in expert speakers, and participants learn the finer skills of persuasion. One thing that makes the program extremely unique is that FFT is run by all volunteers. Those who participated in FFT boot camps are invited and encouraged to stay involved with the program and contribute in whatever way they feel they best can. In addition to tonight's program, next Thursday, July 6th, save the date, we are having our Party for Truth at Dirty Martini, and applications for our next boot camp, if you haven't done it yet, and it's going to begin July 25th, are now available online. We are truly delighted that you are all able to join us tonight for our very first community event, the 50th anniversary of the 6-Day War. Over the past month, there have been numerous events and countless articles about the importance of this anniversary. Our discussion this evening, however, will focus on the experience of the war itself and the lasting impact of the UN's Resolution 242. We are honored to be joined tonight by Herb London, who will discuss the experience and meaning of the 6-Day War, and Shoshana Bryen, who will cover UN Resolution 242 to 2334. We will first hear the remarks, and then Daniel will moderate a discussion, and afterwards we'll have approximately 30 minutes for Q&A from the audience. Before beginning tonight's program, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize and give a special thank you to Abby Schultz, and also to Ariana Kaufman, our FFT-DC social chairs who organized tonight's event, and thank you to all the volunteers that helped as well. And now I'd like to turn it over to Daniel, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to note, feel free to get up, get more food, drink throughout the program. Our first speaker will be Herb London. He's the president of the London Center for Policy Research and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's the former president of the Hudson Institute as well, and is a professor emeritus and the former John M. Olin Professor of Humanities at New York University. He's a graduate of Columbia University and the recipient of a PhD from New York University as well. He's a noted social critic whose work has appeared in every major newspaper and journal of the country, including diverse publications such as Commentary, National Review, American Spectator, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, New York Magazine, New York Times, and a few others. He's been a guest lecturer on many major radio and television news programs at colleges and universities, and has appeared as a co-host in the popular CNN program Crossfire. In addition, he's listed among a number of different lists, including Outstanding People of the 21st Century. And he's a former political candidate in New York and has written widely on U.S. and Middle East policy. And our second guest this evening is Shoshana Bryen, and she is a leading specialist in U.S. defense policy and Middle East affairs, the former executive director and senior director for security policy at JINSA. Ms. Bryen was the author of the widely republished JINSA reports. She has worked at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College and Institute of National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and lectured at the National Defense University in Washington. Ms. Bryen coordinated programs in the Middle East for military professionals that allowed more than 450 American military officers to engage in professional discussions of issues that both unite and divide the United States, Israel, and Jordan. She also created a three-week program to take the cadets and midshipmen of America's service academies to Israel for a 3-week work and study program that has permitted hundreds of future officers to have a positive and in-depth experience in Israel. She's also taken Turkish and Israeli military officers to speak at the service academies and has lectured in the academies as well. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Sun, and Defense News, among other outlets, as well as JINSA. She's a member of the advisory board of the Alethea Foundation, provides opportunities for wounded vets of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and is a member of the board of the Naval Academy Jewish Chapel Foundation. And as Jen mentioned, they'll be speaking about different parts of the Six-Day War, both the war itself and then in the aftermath of the UN resolution. First, I'd like to turn over to Herb for his remarks.
Will you stand up there? Thank you very much, Dan. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. A special pleasure to be with Shoshana, who is one of the more remarkable people that I've come to know recently. Let me just say that in the introduction that you heard about me, the one thing that was Dan neglected to mention is that my daughter is Stacy London of What Not to Wear. The women in this room will know who she is. So that gives me a certain kind of resonance here, even though you may not agree with the positions that I take. The story that I'd like to start with, which I've used with people at the FFT in New York, is a story about a Southern preacher who's giving a sermon on the end of days. And at the end of days, he turns to members of his church and he says, "There will be crying, there will be wailing, there will be the gnashing of teeth." Members of the church listened, could hear a pin drop. To reiterate this point, he says, let me make sure you understand. There's going to be crying, there'll be wailing, and there will be the gnashing of teeth. An elderly man sitting in the front row of the church said, "I very much appreciate your comments, but I don't have teeth." The pastor looked at him and he said, "Let me think about this for a moment. You know, at the end of days, teeth will be provided." Now, the reason why I tell that story is because with the FFT, we provide teeth. Arguments that are necessary for you to understand what is going on in the Middle East and going on with the state of Israel. And let me go through a kind of reminiscence of the Six-Day War for you. In 1967, I was a Fulbright scholar living in Australia. I had a stark, almost Spartan dormitory room. I didn't have a TV, I had a radio. And each day in the beginning of June, I'd listen to that radio and become more and more alarmed. 480,000 Arab troops arrayed against Israel. 2,800 tanks to be designed to attack Israel. Thousands of aircraft, both Egyptian and Syrian, ready to take off and attack Israel. And I wasn't sure what this Jewish kid from New York living in Australia could possibly do. So I called up the embassy in Australia and I said, "I'd like to volunteer. I want to go to Israel." And they said, "Okay, there'll be a freighter taking a number of Jewish people to Israel." Of course, by the time the freighter arrived, the war was over. But it forced me into a position where I started to think through, why do I care? What difference does this make to me? And I go back to my earliest history as a child, and my father was sitting in front of a Philco radio we had in our bedroom in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, and he was listening to events taking place at the United Nations. And as the vote took place and the state of Israel was created, my father, who had never seen cry, started to cry like a child. And I, as a young man, not knowing what to do, tried to console him. And he said, "Don't console me. These are tears of joy. I have never felt better than I do at this moment." Several days later, my father called all of his friends who served in World War II and still possessed weapons, whether they were revolvers or rifles. He said, "Bring them over to the house." And we, my father, and my mom and I, started to wrap them in towels and sheets. We put them in cartons. And they were to be delivered to Palestine. And I went to the docks in New Jersey with my dad, and we had these big cartons on a dolly. And my dad said, "There's the ship. You push the dolly." I said, "Dad, I'm just a kid. I mean, It's a big carton. He said, no, there'll be no problem. You can push it on the dolly. I said, why me? He said, because I'll get arrested. No one's going to arrest the child. So here I am pushing this dolly. So when people talk to me about Israel, I feel a deep emotional commitment to the state. It goes to my earliest history. I am a Zionist. I care deeply about what happens in the state of Israel. So these were all reminiscences during the time this war is going on. And as the war unfolded, it was very clear to me that Israel did not want to attack. The attack of preemption was an attack that was necessary because Israel would have been overrun. And while Israel won this war and won it handily, and of course everyone in the Borscht Belt would tell jokes like, let's trade General Motors for General Diane, the argument that was made at that time was that Israel, the underdog, Israel, the small nation, Israel, that splinter in the Middle East, could defeat all of these Arab nations at the same time. It was a remarkable victory, but a victory that comes with many, many problems. And one of the problems is that when you are a victor in a war of that kind, you go from underdog to top dog. You become the leader in that part of the world, even though only 8 million people, 7 million at that time, could play a role in this burgeoning, this fledgling nation. So I often thought about what has happened as a result of the war. The war united Israel in a quite appropriate manner. The 1,000 years of history are now united in the West Bank, united in the Jewish quarter, united in the Wailing Wall. And so the iconic pictures of those soldiers praying at the Wailing Wall was something that everyone of a certain generation would remember. But what is important to note about all of this is that the Arabs didn't see it the same way. They saw it as a source of humiliation. They saw it as a defeat not only for the very character of their countries, but for the source of what the philosophical basis for most of the Arab nations. They did not believe that this was a victory. And it's one of the reasons why this war has been refought and refought and refought. And so the Green Line, this 1967 line that was established immediately after the war, is in the minds of the Arabs not an appropriate line. It's 1948. Even for those who consider themselves reasonable. Of course, most Arabs are not reasonable. They don't want even the 1948 line. They don't want Israel on the map, as the Hamas charter would clearly suggest. But for those who are reasonable, 1967 doesn't exist. So that war, a war which involved extraordinary strategy and tremendous dedication on the part of the IDF, that war doesn't exist in the minds of most Arabs. And you see that in what has happened in the United Nations subsequently. So when you talk about land for peace, what you really mean with 242 is that all of the land obtained in 1967 no longer exists. And when you talk about the United States abstention at the United Nations very recently, what did that mean? It meant that Kerry and Obama were saying to the Arabs, you know what, we agree with you. That land is not legitimate. It doesn't belong to Israel. So when I say that this was a war that was fought once, twice, 3 and 4 times, we continue to fight that war. And we will continue to fight that war because it is now a diplomatic war. It has very little to do with boots on the ground and what Israeli soldiers are obliged to do. Now, let me come to the conclusion. I feel strongly about Israel because Israel has given an identity to Jews in a way that many Jews, particularly secular Jews in the United States, do not understand and appreciate. In 2 years ago, was the 65th anniversary, so that was roughly 2 years ago, I was invited to attend a ceremony of the Palmach Brigade. These are the people who fought with Yitzhak Bryen in Israel in 67. Yitzhak Rabin was the leader of the Palmach Brigade, and he fought bravely and heroically during that time, and of course later became prime minister. But what was important about this ceremony is that it's held in the funeral where 144 Jewish men lost their lives. And I'm seated at a gravestone. There are lots of people there, roughly 1,000 people present at this ceremony, which occurs every year, but particularly notable because this was the 65th anniversary. And my wife and I are at this gravestone, and I looked down at the name, and in this gravestone there was only one name. Berla. No last name. Every other gravestone had, Edward Rothstein, Bill Schwartzberg, but this gravestone had one name. And I said, that's curious. Why would there only be one name? And so I decided immediately after the ceremony to go to the archive in Tel Aviv and see what I could find out. And sure enough, there was a story about this fellow. He was a 13-year-old when he was apprehended and taken to Auschwitz. He was a strong kid, sturdy body, capable of doing some hard work. And there was no doubt that he would be broken in the camps, emotionally and physically. All of his relatives were incinerated. He had no parents. After a while, he had no memory. He didn't know his name. And so he had a friend who was in the camps with him, and he said, "You look like a Barry." Just an invented name. No one knew if his name was Barry. But as Jews, and you are certainly familiar with this, an ELA is very often added to the end of a name. So I'm Herbala, Mamala, Bubala, and this was Berla. So Berla is finally liberated in 1945 and not really sure about where to go because he has been told that the relocation camps are not particularly safe. So he will not go to the relocation camps. He will not go east because the Russians were apprehending people who were leaving Poland and going east and putting them in the Gulag. And he wouldn't go west because the Poles themselves could very often treat Jews harshly, particularly when they were coming back to Europe to reclaim property that was rightly theirs. So he lives as a vagabond. He collects food when it's thrown away. He lives on the streets. He finds himself in doorways, sleeping with his friend. He has no understanding of what the future holds. But one day his friend says to him, "I'm taking you to another place. I want to go, we're going to get on this ship. We're going to a place called Palestine." He has no idea where Palestine is. So Berla goes with him to Palestine. He arrives in Palestine, and in a couple of hours, this is 1948, someone is saying to him, "We're fighting a war. You're going to be trained." Trained? He doesn't even know how to hold a gun, much less fire a weapon. But he goes to the Palmach Brigade, and they give him a rifle. They train him for 2 hours, and they say, "You're fighting in the Jerusalem corridor." Well, what does Berla know about fighting? But he goes to fight nonetheless. Several hours later, he's killed. Not surprised. The reason why that story is so much poignancy for me is because when the Israeli flag was raised at that ceremony, I asked myself an obvious question. It's a question about identity. Berla didn't even know his name. He didn't have an identity. But when he went to Israel and he fought in behalf of the state of Israel, he had a new identity. An Israeli warrior fighting for independence. I don't forget the Berlas of the world. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about UN Resolution 242. There are copies of the resolution at the ends of each row, and you might at some point want to take a look at the language because I'm not going to read most of it. We're looking back 50 years, and for the most part, things that are 50 years old are not terribly interesting to us. You would not wear your mother's 50-year-old dress. 50-year-old telephone? I doubt it. 50-year-old computers were kept in air-conditioned rooms, and they had less computing power than your Apple Watch. So why is UN Resolution 242 at the age of 50? Still, the linchpin document for Israel in the United Nations. And the answer is because it is the document that contains two things. One is the right understanding of the Arab-Israel war, and the second is security guarantees that Israel needed then and needs today. In 1967, the UN understood that the Six-Day War was a war of Arab aggression against the state of Israel. The Security Council also recognized that the root of the problem was not where Jews lived, but that Jews had sovereignty in space. And the Arabs rejected that. It was the UN's view that that was wrong, that Israel had a historic, legal, moral right to be the homeland of the Jews in the historic Jewish space. The Arabs clearly didn't agree. So the UN Security Council decided that Israel should not be forced to give back land that it acquired in the Six-Day War unless it had some concrete security guarantees. So they created UN Resolution 242 as the security guarantee for Israel. The preamble of the resolution says that the UN emphasizes the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and the need to work for a just and lasting peace in which every state in the region can live in security. Two things are important about the preamble. First of all, it doesn't say that the acquisition of territory by force is wrong. It says by war is wrong. Why? Because Israel acquired the territory by using force in defense of itself. War is what the Arabs did. Defense is what Israel did. And the acquisition of territory by defensive operations is not inadmissible. War is inadmissible. Okay, so remember that, because a lot of people say, well, they acquired the West Bank and the Gaza Strip by force, and force is inadmissible. No, it isn't. Force is okay. War is inadmissible. And second, the UN did not offer Israel peace in 242. It offered Israel security. Peace is a very hard thing to negotiate. In fact, peace probably cannot be negotiated. Peace is the outgrowth of the resolution of problems. It's the outgrowth of agreements, or it's the outgrowth of military victory. Peace is a very nebulous thing. So the UN Security Council said Israel is entitled to security. To ensure that Israel got security, it put two clauses in UN Resolution 242. The first is that Israel had to withdraw from territories occupied in the conflict. Not all the territories, but territories. And second, and here I will read because there's no better language than this. The UN affirmed that Israel's withdrawal would be accompanied by termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. That recognition of Israel's not right to exist. Okay, I find that a very problematic phrase. But Israel is entitled to recognition of its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Those are much more concrete things. Israel is entitled to those. And who is supposed to give those to Israel? The Palestinians? No. Because in 1967, the Palestinians were not a force to be considered. They may be today, but they were not at the time. Israel was entitled to those things from the Arab states that had rejected its legitimacy in 1948 and gone to war against it, and went to war against it again in 1967. So Israel is entitled to have the Arabs say, you're right, we lost. You're legitimate. You can be here. Which states, by the way, aside from Syria, Iraq, Egypt and Jordan did it. They made their peace. But other states that were required to do this because they were in a state of war with Israel, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Algeria, Kuwait, Libya, Morocco, Pakistan, Sudan, Tunisia, and the PLO. Israel has not gotten what the UN said it was entitled to get. And by the way, the UN said that's not enough. Even that, not enough. So they added 3 more points. They added freedom of navigation, because if you remember, one of the reasons that the Six-Day War started was that Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem. Refugees were understood to be both Jewish refugees and Arab refugees. So you needed to settle that problem. And a guarantee of the security of Israel's borders by the use of buffer zones where necessary. So they went way out of their way to be clear. Israel was legitimate. It needed security. It needed secure boundaries. It needed recognition. It needed the Arab states to say that they were wrong. So it should have been simple. So the Arab states should have done it. But they didn't do it. And they have spent, the Arab states have spent the last 50 years trying to change the terms of the conversation from the Arab-Israel war to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, to let themselves off the hook for the fact that in 1947 and 48 and 67 and 73, they did not accept that Israel was a legitimate country. And they've pretty well succeeded in changing the terms of the debate, because now you get to UN Resolution 2334 that was passed in September of 2016, and Here's what Israel gets for security requirements in 2016. The Palestinian security forces must maintain effective operations aimed at confronting all those engaged in terror and dismantling terror capabilities. And the Palestinian Authority must condemn acts of violence against civilians, including terror and acts of provocation. That's it. The Palestinians should dismantle their own army, and they should condemn terrorism. The goal is not any longer Israel with secure and recognized boundaries, but an urgent need to, and this is the UN again, stabilize the situation, reverse negative trends on the ground. What are negative trends on the ground? Houses by Jews where Arabs don't want them. Negative trends on the ground is settlement building, it's community building. So we have to reverse the negative trends on the ground and that are steadily eroding the two-state solution and entrenching a one-state reality. And the other thing the UN wants is to create the conditions for final status negotiations for advancing the two-state solution. Two-state solution. That's not in UN Resolution 242. The territory that Israel acquired is now considered Palestinian territory, which is incompatible with secure and recognized boundaries. The 67 boundaries are what Abba even called Auschwitz borders, indefensible 8-mile-wide borders. The Arab states are off the hook. They no longer have to do anything. And the Palestinians have to promise to take care of the terrorist infrastructure. That's where we've gotten to. And that is what the UN now thinks will bring peace and security to the Middle East. I would suggest the best way to approach Middle East negotiations in the past and now for the future is to go back to 242 and lean on the Arab states who are not 50 years out of date. They're 69 years out of date. Okay, they have been off the track since 1948. That's where you have to go to get, for Israel, secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force. Find me a politician who can do it, and you may see peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
All right, we have a lot to cover here. So I've got a number of questions, obviously, I thought before, based on both your talks, some additional questions that I want to make more conversation about. First off, I want to start with the war itself, and we'll move more towards how, how we remember the war, how the world, the Arab world remembers the war, and kind of from a legal perspective, Resolution 242, 234, the impact thereof. First is, her talking about the war itself and your experience talking about in 48, 47, 48, and then being in Australia for the war. When we learn about the Six-Day War, things seem very linear. One side does this, they do that, and Israel struck first in the Egyptian airfields, and then 6 days later, we're victorious, took our sides. But obviously, history doesn't really play out that way. It's not always so cut and dry, black and white. So if you look at the escalating events, particularly in May of 67, with Nasser dismissing the UN force from the Sinai, which is a buffer zone from there from the 56 war, closed the Straits of Tiran, as Shoshana mentioned. Then Egypt also signed a mutual defense pact with Jordan. At what point, what was the kind of the tenor, the atmosphere in the Jewish community, in the Jewish world at that time? Was it, we're going to be attacked, because Nasser was saying, if Hitler didn't finish the job, maybe we're going to today. Was there any sense that Israel was going to preemptively strike?
Well, it was not clear that Israel would engage in a preemptive strike, but there was a good deal of anxiety in the Jewish community. When you read Michael Oren's wonderful book about the Six-Day War, you do get a sense that Israel was quite reluctant to get involved in the war, but recognized the fact that if it could destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, roughly 8,000 airplanes, that Israel would be able to control the skies and as a consequence control troops on the ground. So there was some understanding of the strategic implications. But as far as the general Jewish community is concerned, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to talk about this in generalities, since there is some variation. But by and large, what I recall is tremendous anxiety, and anxiety that I felt as well, that the very state of Israel that was created in 48 was now clearly in jeopardy.
Okay, and so a lot of what we do here is we go through the Fuel for Truth. We go through the history, and actually we stop the first session, first boot camp evening after the creation of the state, and the second session we pick it up and we cover 67. And you have a comment in this article you wrote for Jewish Policy Center a few weeks ago And so you refer to Jews transforming from Dreyfusards to top dogs, and you kind of you alluded
Well, you
to
know,
that right here.
part of the difficulty is when you talk about the Dreyfus case, what happened in the Dreyfus case is that the argument was made by the French government that you cannot trust Jews, largely because they live in a ghetto, they're not part of the nation, they are not truly French, that they are different from the French. As a consequence, when they talked about who are likely to be the quislings in our society, it's going to be the Jews. And even though there was no evidence to support the claims, as we now know, nonetheless, J'accuse was the accusation that the Jews could not be trusted, that the Jews were clearly working for the enemy. And that was understandable when you consider the French mindset. These Jews, they live in these ghettos, they live apart from the society, they are not loyal to France.
Yeah.
Of course, that was not true, but that was, of course, a perception.
Right, but something that strikes me is I can see how maybe outside the state of Israel, there might be the understanding that from like perhaps people's ancestors' experience in France, the kind of collective Jewish experience, that was the perception of how Jews were treated in Europe. As after Israel has been existing for over 20 years and won 2 wars, that Dreyfusard mentality did apply to Sabras as well, or is it more, again, perhaps a diaspora experience?
I think that's more the diaspora experience, but there is no doubt that the perception in the Arab world is that Jews cannot be trusted. It is interesting. And he still felt a deep sense of humiliation about the '67 war. Now you would think 50 years have gone by, or close to it at that point, and it would be past, but it wasn't past. There's a deep sense in the Arab world that the Jews are untrustworthy, that the Jews have a certain mindset, that the Jews were colonialists. None of this, of course, is true. The Jews were hanging on with their fingernails to retain this land of Israel. The Jews were working feverishly to do everything in their power, both diplomatically and in every other sense, to maintain the state. But that is certainly not the view of the Arabs during that period.
So then I wonder, what would you say is the more impacting or long-lasting war in Shoshana? Please feel free to chime in as well on this. 1948 or 1967? What was more foundational or watershed in the Middle East?
Well, this is like asking me, do I prefer my middle daughter to my older daughter? I mean, they're both absolutely critical in history. The Jews in 1948 had almost nothing to defend themselves with. It was really a rather remarkable occasion. In fact, there was a fellow I knew very well, who passed his mortal coil, named Exil Fetterman. Exil Fetterman was the Santa Claus of the Haganah. That's the way he was described. And he was the one who managed to get all of the parts from Czechoslovakia that led to the so-called Air Force of Israel. It was a makeshift Air Force. They managed to put
Or
together,
planes,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure I would call them planes, but they were held together with airplane glue. And he raised the money for it. And the manner in which he raised the money is very interesting because it tells a story about Israel in 1948. The British sent boots to the Middle East for their soldiers, thousands. But there were only left boots. There were no right boots. British general says, what am I going to do with these left boots? So Fetterman says, give them to me. He says, why would you want left boots? He said, don't worry, just give them to me. So Fetterman takes the boots and he says, if the British send left boots, somewhere in the Middle East, they have to be right boots. And he found them. And that's how he raised the money to provide for this Air Force, Israeli Air Force. So it was remarkably clever. And that cleverness was also shown in 1967. I mean, when you consider the fact that here you had 480,000 Arab troops arrayed against Israel. I mean, it's a formidable force. Some of them have also had battle experience. And here, Israel, this tiny little nation, really had very little experience in fighting wars. But the cleverness of the Israelis to engage in this preemptive strike, even though they did it reluctantly, but they recognized the fact that if we do not engage in preemption, there is no way we're going to win this war. They did, and of course, we know the rest of the story.
I would add to that. I occasionally do prefer my middle daughter to my younger daughter. So and then I have a son and another daughter, but never mind. I would, ouch, yeah, but they don't know which ones, they don't know.
Well, it's not all recording this. I'll say that.
It's on camera, Shoshana. I mean, you got a problem.
Okay. there's nothing that they don't know about their parents either. I would say that 67 was actually a more gut-wrenching experience in the sense that in 48, they didn't have anything. They didn't expect anything. It was a few years after the Holocaust, the story that you told of Berlitz, there was nothing. By 67, they had a country that was functioning. People were making new arrangements. People were making new lives for themselves. The Arab refugees had been coming from, the Israeli Arab refugees had been coming from across North Africa. People were coming into Israel and they were building a society. And the one thing that I remember about the run-up to the 67 war was rabbis discussing the halakha of mass graves because they thought it was going to be taken from them again. And at that point, they had something to lose. And so winning and winning big and understanding that you could stay in that region and they would not throw you out, I think that was a more formative experience, a more nation-building experience than hanging onto the rocks with your fingernails.
Interesting.
It's also one of the reasons why I regard it as a celebratory event.
67.
Very reason,
Yes.
yeah, 67.
Oh, absolutely.
So with that, I wasn't expecting that answer actually. I was thinking 48. At least some, bone thrown at 48 because finally, first time in 2,000 years, Zionism was realized and Jews established the state. And if they lost that war, God forbid, what would have happened? Wouldn't know. But
Well, that's why I said I'm willing to choose between my two.
right.
You're not.
So it's interesting that actually Herbie commented that the Arabs don't recognize 67. Kind of like in the pathos, they don't necessarily recognize 67. So I'm actually interested in, given what you were saying, Shoshana, I was hoping to give a different answer. But, well, talking about the UN resolutions, 242 and 181. Of course, 181 is the UN resolution 181 from November 1947, as all FFTers know. Hopefully everyone in the audience knows. Was basically the UN partitioning the Palestinian mandate into an Arab land, a Jewish land, and essentially international control over Jerusalem. I wonder then, why do we talk so much about 242 and really don't talk much about 181? 181 is almost kind of understood, it's a given, or if you talk to people, they don't, unfortunately kind of on our side, some on the other side don't really want to recognize 181 or don't really know much about 181. So would you say one is more fundamental to understanding the dynamics of the Middle East or the situation Israel finds itself in even today?
The Arabs didn't accept 181. For them, it didn't exist. So for the Israelis, for the Jews, they operated under it. They created the state of Israel. The UN, does not create countries. The UN sets out the parameters under which countries declare themselves independent. And Israel went ahead and did those things. The Arabs never did. So why talk about it? It's not important. They screwed it up in 47. They repeated it, the mistake, in 67. 181 is just not irrelevant.
And they carved out an Arab state, and it was a failure. And one of the things that was always so interesting to me is that one day I went to Petra in Jordan, and I went to this dusty town of Aqaba, right at the Red Sea. Yeah. And it was 120 degrees. I was so eager for an ice cream cone. And so all I wanted was an ice cream cone. So I'm going from store to store. Do you have ice cream? No, no ice cream. I decided I'm going to walk from Aqaba to Eilat. Now I go from walking at the speed of a camel to the speed of electricity. Ice cream in 28 different flavors. Now, you're sitting in Aqaba, you can look at Israel. You can see that you can't get an ice cream cone in Aqaba. You can't even swim in the Red Sea because that swimming area is controlled by the king. You go to Eilat, you can swim, you can gamble, you've got Las Vegas there, you've got ice cream in 28 flavors. Of course there's envy. So here you've carved out an Arab state in 181. But what did that mean? And then you look at what Israel has done with virtually nothing. It's remarkable. It's an absolute miracle.
And I would add to that, by the way, that today you have the Eilat Aqaba free trade zone.
Right.
Because the Jordanians may not have been able to do it by themselves, but at some point, and there is good news in the Middle East periodically, At some point, the Jordanians realized that their best hope of improvement for themselves and their people was to align with Israel in certain ways. Economically, certainly. You can now be a Jordanian worker and go to Israel on a daily basis and work in the hotels in Israel. It's made a huge difference in Aqaba. So for some Arabs, they look at that and they say, boy, that is really something. I can now go to work over here. I have money for my family. My kids can go to school. I can do whatever I want. And then there are other Arabs who look at that and say, that's bad. And that's what Israel is fighting in the region. The Jordanians at least have gotten there.
The Egyptians are, leadership perhaps is there, the
Yeah,
population
but it's also a physical problem. There's a huge Sinai desert between Cairo and the closest spot in Israel. So it's not like looking across from Aqaba. So it's harder.
Right.
Although, there's one point I'd make about Egypt and Israel. The war that's going on in the Sinai, where the Egyptians have taken heavy casualties against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Israel has been fighting that war with the Egyptians. This doesn't receive an awful lot of international attention, but the Egyptian government recognizes the value of having those Israeli Apaches cross the border and fight that war and bomb ISIS strongholds. So this has created some ties, at least military to military. There are very close ties between Israel and Egypt. In fact, at one point when Benny Gantz was chief of staff in Israel, he was receiving more calls from the Minister of Defense than he was from the Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, right. Actually, when I was serving, I remember we heard that Egypt had requested to send, I believe, a company or a battalion of armored personnel into Sinai, which per the Accords, this is under Mubarak too, per the Accords, they had to get agreement with Israel, and this isn't just happening last year or two, it's happening for a number of years now, which is good.
The Israelis have in fact taken away those restrictions on Egyptian military forces in the Sinai that were part, as you say, part of the Camp David Accords. The Israelis have said, never mind.
Right.
So one of the things we cover in Fuel for Truth is looking at UN bias, UN and media bias, kind of how the UN, it's a little bit kind of outside our topic, but actually I'm very curious about this based on your talks, is that, Shoshana, you talked about how 242 did not offer peace, but offered security. And you almost spoke of the UN, sounds like blasphemy today, but almost in an admiring way. What the UN did was almost admirable.
It was.
They recognized Israel has these security needs. Peace could follow, but just like the UN doesn't create states, doesn't make peace. But today when we look at the UN, we think, it's a darkness that Israel is the only candle there is, right? So how did we go from the UN, and I'm the history of the UN, I'm going to history of the UN, but what counts for the UN essentially creating conditions for the state of Israel in 1947, recognizing Israel's requirements or security needs in 67, but then you fast forward 50 years and, had any profanity you want, probably applies to the UN.
Do not fast forward 50 years.
Right.
Only fast forward into the 70s, and you get oil and terrorism, at which point the European countries proved themselves to be cowardly and unwilling to stand for the same things they were willing to stand for at the end of World War II and through the period of decolonization through the end of the 40s, which included the creation of the State of Israel. They were blackmailed and they were terrorized, and that was it. And they threw in the towel. There's a great book. If you have time for a book, I don't know if Fuel for Truth lets you have time to read, right?
Send too many emails.
Joshua Moravchik, Muravchik, okay? Making David into Goliath. Josh goes through it all the way. Oil had two impacts. One was they threatened to withhold it from Europe, and it's very cold in Europe in the winter, so the Europeans caved to that pressure. But the other was that the Arabs then had oil money, and they began to spend it in ways that the Europeans liked, and they threatened to take that money away. Today you see it with Qatar. A great many institutions in Washington have taken a great deal of money from Qatar, and Qatar is also a country that supports the Muslim Brotherhood and terrorism, so it influences how people see things. So oil in both directions, and terrorism, and you go through that long enough, and you go through the Arabs saying, hey, it's not our problem. Fix this Palestinian problem, and then we'll fix the Arab-Israel problem. They inverted the process.
It's become an interesting distraction for Arab states to rely on fixing the Palestinian problem until very recently. Or in fact, I don't think anyone really cares. No one in the Sunni world cares. But what is also interesting, and I think Shoshana has mentioned this indirectly, is the Nakba, this narrative that has been used by the Palestinians very effectively in Europe and to some degree even in the United States. If you look at some of the organizations, even Jewish organizations, like J Street, for example, this is the argument that they make. And when I've challenged Ben Ami and others in J Street about issues of this kind, invariably they'll say, well, you have a point, but it's the recalcitrance of Netanyahu that stands in the way of peace in the Middle East. That's the argument. So therefore, we're trying to make Israel appear more flexible. That's why we have the BDS movement. It's an absurd argument, but that's the argument that's employed. So this view, this narrative the Arabs have made has penetrated the Jewish community and penetrated many areas where you would think people would under no circumstances adopt this position.
So it actually segues real nicely to my next question. In just a few moments, we have a couple more questions. We'll open up to the audience, so get your questions at the ready. I'll make sure that they stay questions also. But what lessons did Israel learn from 1967? Perhaps in a decade or two after it, and then looking back 50 years, I think a lot of people thought 50 years ago, hey, there might be peace, especially the signing agreements with Egypt in 1979. But what lessons would you say Israel's learned from 67?
Do you want me to start with that one?
Please.
The first and perhaps most important lesson learned is that Israel cannot rely on anyone, even the United States. If you look at the buildup of the Israeli military, and it's occurred in the post-67 period, it's been dramatic. Israel now has the arrow and the sling, David Sling, and all these anti-missile systems that are designed to forestall any attacks. But more importantly, Israel recognizes the fact that it might have to fight a two-front or even a three-front war. As a consequence, if you spend any time with the Israeli military, you very quickly come to the conclusion they're prepared for almost any conceivable attack. And they are not going to rely on allies. They realize they do not have any reliable allies. The other thing that has occurred, which I think is somewhat interesting, is that when Trump delivered his Riyadh speech, he made it entirely clear that we want what he described as an Arab NATO. It is the Sunni nations working together to offset the influence of Iran. The Iranian tilt that you had during the Obama administration, in my judgment, was thoroughly misguided. But leave my judgment out of the equation. What I think is important is that the Israelis recognize the fact there are now alliances that are possible. How reliable they are over the long term remains to be seen. But if someone would have said to me 5 years ago that you would have a military delegation to go from Riyadh to Jerusalem to talk about joint military maneuvers, I would say you're smoking hallucinogens. I wouldn't think it was possible, and yet it did occur. So what you're seeing now is a different correlation of forces in that part of the world. Now, Trump may be very pro-Israel, but it remains to be seen. It's premature to make any judgments yet. And my own feeling about it is there's so much ground that has to be made up because of what Obama did, the damage that he did in the relationship between Israel and the United States, that it's going to be very difficult. But there are some positive developments just over the horizon, I believe, notwithstanding the fact that Israel is facing a very significant threat from Hezbollah with its 150,000 missiles all aligned to attack Israel. And of course the Iranian forces themselves, the Quds forces.
If I could actually just ask you, keep one thing, so maybe I misheard it. So Israel learned not to trust foreign countries, other countries, and it's primarily because when they asked the French for help, de Gaulle said it's not 56, right?
That's right.
Because there was an agreement that when Israel was going to...
And even in 73, I mean, there was a lot of
right.
controversy. Did Kissinger provide assistance? Did Nixon? Were they reluctant to? I mean, it is very clear that it's not always what it appears to be the case.
But then what are you talking about the alliances? Alliances between Israel and...
I'm saying that there is now a possibility, as a result of the Riyadh speech, for the creation of an Arab NATO with Israel as an unregistered member of that NATO alliance. Now, I say unrecognized because if you were to say recognized, Sisi already has a big bullseye on his back. It only becomes bigger should Israel be formally recognized. And I don't think Israel would want that anyway. But Israel will play a role in logistics and intelligence, in the military hardware. There's no question Israel will play a role. So that's what I meant by this kind of alliance that's emerging, which one wouldn't have anticipated 5, 6 years ago.
No, and Israel's providing a lot of those things behind the scenes, certainly just Saudi Arabia
right.
and other nations.
That's right. The back channel conversations are very interesting, and they're ongoing.
Looking at the UN perspective, for the last 50 years, 242 has defined, quote unquote, the peace paradigm, right? A land for peace. I appreciate you calling out that it's not to make peace, to make security, and the difference between, when you talk about 242, force and war. Those are two very good nuances I appreciate you mentioned. Do you think this paradigm will persist? I hate to say another 50 years, hopefully there's peace in our time.
Hopefully we don't need it for 50 years. Yes, I really had a moment of serious panic in December when they passed 2334. And interestingly, so did the Europeans. Because if you look at the January 2017 peace conference that the French hosted, which was really useless in most of its aspects, they very clearly said that peace needs to be on the basis of UN Resolution 242. It was in the final communique. It was one of the few things they agreed on. So I think they realized they'd overshot their standards. They don't have very much in the way of standards, Europeans. But whatever little standards they had, they'd overshot them with 2334. So I suspect that you will find, if the United States in particular holds up 242 and says this is the way to go, I think we'll go that way. And I think because we have a great UN ambassador right now, I mean, stop and applaud Nikki Haley, right?
Yeah.
She is very, very careful about how she promotes American interests in the Middle East as pro-Israel interests, and UN Resolution 242 is a piece of that. So I think if the Trump administration leads, somebody else might follow.
Interesting. On that note, there starts to take questions from the audience. Yeah, Don.
Hi. First, thank you both for speaking and Daniel for moderating. You mentioned the euphoria in Israel after the Six-Day War, and I'm wondering from both of you, just coming off of that, if you could, broadly paint the major legacies that came out of that war.
Well, there was no question about the self-confidence that existed immediately after that war. There was also no question that it appeared to be the real union of an Israel in the present and an Israel in the past. The sense of Israel as a nation that goes back in biblical history is now reunited with the present. And so that, I think, is extremely, extremely important. But the other significant legacy that I made reference to is the fact that the Arabs never recognized the victory that the Israelis achieved, and that the war continues to be refought. And as Shoshana has pointed out, refought in the United Nations. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is that the language in Israel has changed. Solzhenitsyn once made the point that peace only exists for utopians. That the difference between war and something else is stability. There's war and stability. And I think Israelis understand that. People don't use the word peace any longer. They understand that peace is probably not achievable in a lifetime. Maybe it occurs 100 years from now, but not now. And so there's an understanding about what does stability mean? How do we maintain the status quo to the extent that it provides for the stability in Israel? And that, I think, has changed the debate a great deal. It's also a legacy.
I would say Michael Oren said that the two things that Israel gained in the Six-Day War, one was defensible borders. It is much easier to defend Israel in its present incarnation than it was prior to the Six-Day War. And the acquisition of Jerusalem and holy places for the Jewish people, because that gave Israel a connection to the diaspora Jewish world that it hadn't had before. Jerusalem is the center not only of Israel, it's the center of the Jewish world. And not having it and not having access to Jerusalem, Eastern Jerusalem, the Jewish patrimony of Jerusalem, was a big problem for Israel from 48 to 67. And so acquiring that changed the relationship between Israel and the diaspora Jewish world. And both of those things, he said, were great accomplishments of the war, and I think he's right.
If you guys could talk a little bit more about the on-the-ground realities today, regarding acquisition of territory in 67.
The first thing you should look at is the Golan Heights, and consider the pressure that Israel has been under for a long time to give the Golan Heights to Syria. Bill Clinton wanted to put American troops on the Golan Heights so that the Israelis would give it to the Syrians and American troops would be there under Syrian control. Imagine, if you can, what Israel would look like today in the condition of the Syrian civil war, if there were Syrians on the top. So today's life is defined by Israel's ability to protect that life and the decisions Israel has made in 67 and since 67 are the decisions that keep it alive.
And one of the things that's quite notable that keeps Israel alive is the extent to which the military-industrial complex in Israel has been so imaginative in dealing with the weaponry that's necessary to maintain the peace. I've been in the Israeli F-16. It looks just like our F-16, except that the avionics are entirely Israeli. That plane takes off almost as a vertical takeoff plane. In just seconds, it's off the ground, because Israel doesn't have the luxury of letting that plane go entirely down the runway. And that's true with almost all of the weapons in Israel. They're designed for the problems or the factors that go into the calculus in war in the Middle East. And Israel has been enormously clever in thinking that through.
There's an old joke in the Army that if Israel get an F-16 from the U.S., by the time it's done putting its own equipment in there, the price tag is doubled, the cost of a plane. And there's a new book that I've not read yet, Wizards of War, I believe, by, I'm looking at his name right now, somebody Katz. Israeli guy writing about the technological revolution, kind of like a startup nation type book for the IDF. Yeah. Sam?
So you talked about the Israel sort of, I guess, the industrial military complex having been built up since 1967. And you talked about the comparison between the American F-16 and the Israeli F-16. So I wonder how important was American military aid to Israel since 1967? And if Israel were to finally reject American military aid with the idea of getting out from under American pressure, how would that transform the Israeli military? How much of a dire loss would that be?
It would be a loss, not as much of a loss as it would have been 20 years ago. It would be a loss, but I don't think so significant. In fact, arguments have been made, and I think very effective arguments, that when the United States aid goes to Israel, which generally is used to purchase military hardware, that the United States ought to give that money back to Israel. I'm not sure that in the short term that makes any sense, because as I said, we have entered an age where the kind of military hardware that one uses is so sophisticated and so different. And as clever as the Israelis are, and as well placed the industrial complex in Tel Aviv, outside of Tel Aviv, their own version of Silicon Valley, still not quite up to the standard of the United States. So I think there is some reliance on the United States, and you saw that with David Sling. And I think that you will see that in the future as well. There are all kinds of new unmanned aircraft drones that are coming on board. The latest drones that I've seen very recently, which have been made in California, are the size of a bumblebee, but could cause enormous damage. So you could put a bumblebee in this room and it could blow up the room. Very, very sophisticated. Again, Israelis don't possess it. It was developed here in the United States. So in the short term, I'm not sure there's an answer.
The biggest lobby in this country for U.S. military aid to Israel is the American defense establishment. First of all, because 75% of everything Israel gets in dollars has to be spent by law here. So it's a works project for the American defense industry. The technology, however, is symbiotic. And so we develop and they get, they develop and we get. The people who would least like to change that relationship is the American military establishment. The Israelis, on the margins, use our money to develop some high-tech things that we are not that interested in. Things that relate specifically to their concerns, not to ours. But the joint stuff is where the real money is, and the joint stuff is where the real impetus for friendship and cooperation and sharing is.
Even during the Obama years, the military-to-military cooperation was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I mean, that's a really important point.
May I ask a quick follow-up? So if Israel decided that it was tired of American military aid, how quickly and how easily would it be able to get out from under it?
No.
Not. And they
As I
don't
said,
want
in the
to.
short term, it's not going to happen.
They're not tired of it. I mean, there's something to be said for total independence. Okay, that's a nice thing. They're not tired of the cooperation that comes with that money.
And with the new memorandum of understanding, that offshore procurement, the 26.4 basically 25% of money that can be spent back in Israel is going to be phased out, whereas at the end of the 10 years, all of it is spent in the U.S.
But remember that that's an executive agreement,
Right.
which means that it did not outlast President Obama. If the next president or the current president wants to change it, he'll change it.
Okay. Good to hear. Did I know that?
That was not passed by, that was not part of a bill, that is not part of legislation in Congress. That was a determination by President Obama. So we'll see where it goes.
We'll see. That's, yes.
So, thank you so much for coming by the way, this has been fascinating. When you hear today of progressive groups taking public stances saying that Zionism is Nazism and we're proud to kick out Zionists because they're evil, how do you suggest that we as Zionists respond to that? How do you think that it's changed over the past 50 years? And how do you suggest that we not only respond to it, but proactively point out how wrong that is?
Point out their duplicity for one.
That's a start.
I think that's the right start. And you keep in mind, I mean, you know, we know who the other side of this equation happens to be. It's the J Street crowd and the New Israel Fund. We're very much aware of what they have attempted to do with the BDS, which is designed primarily to delegitimize and demonize the state of Israel. That's the purpose of it. And so we understand the arguments. The problem is there aren't enough people with the courage to stand up and say what is necessary. I think that we can make the arguments, our side can make the argument very effectively. But young people in the United States today do not have the same commitment to Israel that might have been true of an earlier generation. That is one of the problems. And if you also consider the intimidation factor that exists at American universities, it's very, very hard to be courageous when in fact you're standing alone. There are too many people standing with you. But one group in the United States that has been quite remarkable in supporting Jews in this matter have been evangelicals. And what I often find interesting is that so many Jews reject the evangelicals. Well, they're allies. I don't know whether in fact I have to believe in the idea that Christ is coming back to earth, but I certainly believe in the idea that these are allies perfectly willing to defend my position. So I can look for allies of that kind. I think that what you need is not only an understanding of the issues, but the willingness to go to the universities in the United States and say what is necessary. I do it all the time. I'm generally lambasted with tomatoes, eggs. I mean, all of that has happened. But it doesn't make any difference to me. If I can make one convert in the university, I'm happy to do it.
There's also something to be said for understanding the tactics of the other side. BDS is becoming a losing proposition. Okay, 32 American states now have anti-BDS legislation. Why? Because people understood how they were trying to sneak in this disinvestment stuff, how they were trying to sneak in the boycott stuff, and they called them on it. And very few legislators wanted to be associated with that. So I would suggest that we understand what they do on campus, get around it by using their own tactics, making sure that you are there. It's not clear to me that you can engage J Street one-to-one, but there must be on college campuses lots of pro-Israel activity. And you have to insist that it take place and insist that it happen. The organization ACTA, the Association of College Trustees and Administrators, several tens of thousands of college trustees and administrators, has now gone on the march against BDS on campus and in favor of intellectual diversity and pro-Israel activity on campuses. Huge ally. Why? Are they Zionists? No, I don't think so. But they see the closing of American universities as a very bad thing. And so you find your allies, pick your battles, and go to war.
It's interesting because the people who they write checks to, presumably American Studies Association, for example, they're supportive of BDS.
Wait a minute. Oh, they're not, actually. They voted it down. My daughter-in-law is she's an American history professor, and she's my spy in the American Studies Association. Also the American History Association, also the she goes around and does this. Institutions like the American History Association, the American Studies Association, are chartered nonprofits. They live under the government's largesse, that if you give them a contribution, you don't pay taxes on it, and they don't pay taxes. Doing political work is outside their charter, it violates the law. And so in many cases now, people have begun to bring suit against their own academic organizations because they are afraid that they're going to lose their nonprofit status. So again, I think, know your enemy, pick your battle. The American Studies Association is giving up the fight on BDS because they are afraid that they will lose their nonprofit status. You've got to know where to go in this fight.
I think the things that you've said about the BDS movement in the United States are clearly valid, not quite as valid in Europe. Where in fact, the BDS movement has gained tremendous traction at European universities and colleges. I was the founder of an organization called the National Association of Scholars. One of our children is active. We created active. And so if you take the two organizations, we have 3,000 registered members in the National Association of Scholars, and we have roughly 2,000 trustees. You have a powerful force, very powerful political force that can be used effectively, and unfortunately has not been used as effectively as I think it could be.
What else can it do? What else would you like to see it do?
We have professors at every university from Berkeley to University of Texas to NYU. And there's no reason why they couldn't sponsor events in those colleges, organized by professors who are there to provide a different point of view. If in fact the arguments to be made for ACTA and the National Association of Scholars is the freedom to express one's view, that diversity of opinion is necessary, that the free and open exchange of ideas is the premise on which a university is organized. It seems to me there's a valid argument in putting these events together. Now, I understand intimidation. I understand what's going on. There are actual real threats that exist on campus today. But nonetheless, if people can display some courage and are willing to work together, there's an awful lot that can be achieved.
Eva, just something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly to what Shoshana was saying. My organization, the Bryen Center, and this row of people right here, we all work for the Bryen Center. We actually filed a lawsuit against the American Studies Association for their unlawful boycott of Israeli academic
Good for you.
institutions, and we are moving forward to the discovery phase. So
That's great.
yeah,
That is great. And there's a congressman from Colorado, who is Doug Lamborn, who is proposing national anti-BDS legislation. Yes, it's moving through the states, and that's fine, and it should. We'll get to all 50 states. But he's also looking for federal anti-BDS legislation. There are allies out there. And I think, first of all, of course you're right, it's not nearly as good in Europe. We have a much stronger tradition of intellectual diversity than they do, and we have to play to our own strength.
Yeah, the back. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jordan Weber. I also work at the Brandeis Center. So my question is, we talked a little bit about how the 67 war influenced the diaspora and how in its perception of Israel. How did the 67 war impact how the general non-Jewish majority in the West perceived Israel? And how did that change, and what impact has that had on the way that Israel interacts with the Western countries?
Here's a good question.
It is an excellent question. Look, I would say the following about it. In my judgment, the world recognized Israel as an underdog prior to '67, a nation that was struggling to survive. But after '67, there was a different view that emerged. Israel has become the strong horse in that region. Israel was seen very differently. And as I indicated, even if you rely on the kind of Borscht Belt jokes, we're going to trade General Motors for General Diane. The fact is that General Diane became something of a role model for many in the world, someone who was strong, clever, and understood military strategy. So there was a change in attitude. And again, it was subtle, but over time, I think it gained an awful lot of traction. It's one of the arguments that's still made today, where why would you support Israel? It's a colonial state. I mean, if you read Edward Said, what do you get? You get in Edward Said the view Israel as exploiters, it's a colonial state. And if you pick up a crossword puzzle in the Palestinian territory, and you want a 4-letter word for exploiters, JEWS. So there's no question that the mood in the world did start to change as a result of Israel's extraordinary success in '67.
Yes, Adam.
Adam Turner with the Endowment for Middle East Truth. Just a question about now, after the beginning of the Arab Spring, obviously not a spring, What do you think about the rise of the Kurds, and how helpful can they be to Israel?
Kurds are good. Kurds are good.
They are.
There is the person who, it's actually my husband, who says the Kurds are always in the way, but that one takes a minute. Look, the Kurds did not get a country during the breakup of the Ottoman Empire because they did not have a good advocate. You know, the Jews had good advocates after World War I who were willing to make the case for Zionism and the Balfour Declaration and the partition and all of those things. And the Kurds did not. The Kurds understand themselves as a minority in the region. Ethnically, religiously, they're not all Muslims. They have a different set of experiences, and they are a pretty democratic people. What the Kurds can do for Israel is a lot less clear than what Israel does for the Kurds. Okay, the Israelis have helped the Kurds in many, many cases, with training, with weapons, with intelligence, and they have a very good relationship. I don't think it's a quid pro quo. I don't think the Israelis are looking for anything back. They think the Kurds were screwed in the beginning of the century, and if they can help them now with the breakup of states, then they'll do it.
I think there's an awful lot, there's a very powerful argument for the creation of a Kurdish state, notwithstanding the Turkish resistance to the idea. The problem is that the Kurds cannot get themselves together. The Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Syria don't talk to one another. The Kurds who are operating in Iraq very often get the weapons but don't deliver the weapons to Peshmerga. There are all kinds of problems that exist in the Kurdish community itself. So that has to be addressed, and probably could be addressed. I think that if you're looking at the possibilities for a Kurdish state, all you have to do is look at what the Kurds have been able to establish in Iraq. I mean, it's the most prosperous area in Iraq, and then not only because they have the oil fields, but also because they have a rather diverse economy. They've got a university that works very effectively. I've lectured there. I'm quite impressed by what the Peshmerga have been able to do. And they've been fighting with at least one hand tied behind their back. The United States continues to insist we're going to give them weapons. But those weapons never end up in the hands of the Peshmerga. They're on the black market. They can be found all over the Middle East, but they're not in the hands of the Kurds. So there's a problem in making sure that the Kurds get the weapons that they need. But I think Shoshana stated it properly, that Israel has done an awful lot for the Kurds. I'm not sure the reverse exists at the moment. However, if there were a Kurdish state, it would be a pro-Israel state.
Are we not getting, isn't Israel getting oil from the Kurds as well?
The Israelis bought a ship full of oil. I don't know how much more they bought after that. They had loaded an oil tanker, the Kurds had, and they really needed the money, and they really needed to get rid of the oil, and the Israelis bought it. I think it was a one-off. I don't think they do it as a matter of course.
There's also some argument to be made that it's really not totally benevolent, but it's in the event that Kurdistan does come into being, it kind of goes back to the Israel's periphery strategy back in the 50s and 60s, kind of like the non-Arab Muslim states that it was aligned with. Iran's clearly out of that equation today. Turkey is on and off, generally off these days, but it would be another kind of voice for Israel in the Middle East.
That's right.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael Lippin with the Voice of America. I have a question about borders. I'd like to know what is the future of the Palestinian and Arab demand, which was backed by the Obama administration, that Israel should, quote unquote, swap land with the Palestinians by giving them parts of what people call Israel proper, or pre-67 Israel, if it wants to keep any of the West Bank settlements. So what is the future of this concept in light of the fact that the Trump administration has not endorsed this idea like the Obama people did, and the fact that Netanyahu has never publicly endorsed that idea?
Well, actually he did. But
When was that?
more than once. But the real problem with the concept from the Israeli point of view is that it violates UN Resolution 242. 242 says that 1949 armistice line is ephemeral, that under the circumstance of the Arab states meeting their obligations under 242, a new, secure, and recognized boundary will be created. An armistice line is an armistice line. So if you have the Arab states accepting the legitimacy and territorial integrity of the state of Israel, you have to draw a border. And the border has to be secure and recognized. The 67 line is simply not secure. So if you start with the idea that all of that territory acquired by Israel in 67 is actually part of Palestine, and the only way for Israel to keep it, any of it, is to swap out something else, you are not dealing with 242. And it's one of the reasons Israel insists that 242 is the linchpin of the conversation. And I think you'll get more. I thought for a minute President Trump and Netanyahu were making almost that case when they talked about regional solutions during the press conference in February. That's how you find the border. But it's not necessary under 242 to say, yes, 67 was the border, and now we'll swap out. And by the way, the Palestinians not only have not accepted it, they have rejected the concept.
Keep in mind that you had Iraq.
Rejected what?
The concept of swaps. The idea of swaps.
But I think in the Arab Peace Initiative, there was some movement towards saying that there could be swaps.
Well, the Arab Peace Initiative says that Israel has to return to the 67 borders, including half of Jerusalem, and then the Arab states will talk to it about everything else. So the Arab Peace Initiative, which was not signed on to, by the way, by the Palestinians, it's a Saudi peace initiative, also is a violation of 242, which is the reason the Israelis said the concept is it's okay to find a mechanism to talk to the Arab states, but the Arab Peace Initiative is a non-starter because it says the Israelis have to go back to the 67 border first, and that's not happening.
Herb, do you have anything to add?
I was going to say something about Barak, not important. He was willing to give up 90% of the West Bank, as you well
And
know.
Jerusalem.
And so in Jerusalem, so here you had a concession on the part of Israel to give up what I thought was absolutely unconscionable. And yet it was rejected by the Arabs in large part because Abbas recognized full well, Arafat recognized full well that what he wanted was a Palestinian state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. That was the goal. And so he knew that he could not sustain the kind of support he was getting from the Arab nations if he were to accept this. And that was why Abu Ibn, among others, was saying the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
You know, which, by the way, is the other reason to take 242 first. Asking Abu Mazen to agree to peace with Israel when his benefactors and supporters, the Arab states, don't, is a ridiculous thought. So Abu Mazen is 83. He's had cancer twice. And he says, look, the Saudis and the Qataris who fund my operation, they don't agree to peace with Israel, but I do. They don't want me to agree the Jews should have Jerusalem, but I agree they can have Jerusalem. They don't want me to accept that the Galilee can be part of a legitimate independent, but I agree to that. Can you imagine it? Neither can he. So it's not happening. If you get the benefactors first to say to Abu Mazen, Israel is here, it's always going to be here, it's legitimate for it to be here, now let's find the border, let's make Palestine, you have a much better chance of success.
A few minutes left, one final question from the audience. Yeah.
Just a follow-up to what you just said, but didn't you say in what it looks like on the news, in public, that it looks like Saudi is changing direction, so that could be a start of something?
Could be.
But we don't know what the Crown Prince will do when he gets into power. He has a kind of modernist view. He studied in the United States. He has a different sense about what Saudi Arabia will become. He has to walk a thin line between the Wahhabist view and modernity. He recognizes that. Can he pull this off? I don't know the answer. I can only tell you that there will be enormous changes, a real convulsion that occurs in Saudi Arabia, and will have some sort of bearing on its relationship with Israel.
It's also probably a bit of a jump from increasing security cooperation to the custodian himself, to a holy mosque, to say, oh, our third holiest place, we can't actually give that up.
That's right.
That's
Exactly.
a huge jump.
Yeah,
That's right.
a pretty big jump.
That's right.
Any final questions? Actually, that's a good. Yeah, Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt Ross, FFT alumnus, and thanks for coming today, by the way. I actually just wanted to get clarification on something. There was, you said it multiple times throughout the discussion, and again during the questions, about how the Arab states don't even recognize that the 67 war. And I guess I was just confused what exactly you meant. Like, how do they, is there a manifestation of that? Do they just not, did they refuse to get off the...
Look, this is an emotional reaction. It has nothing at all to do with what actually occurred. Egypt is a military state. If I were to ask people in this room, how many of you have a relative that serves in the military? The answer would probably be about 10%. In the United States, that would be about the standard. In Egypt, if I were to ask the same question, it's 95%. Everyone has been associated with the military. It is a military culture. When you heard about the so-called coup, and 33 million people were on the streets of Egypt, and the President Obama said this is a military coup, well, that was a contradiction. It is a military country. I mean, everyone has served in the military. And it wasn't a coup anyway, if 33 million people were on the streets. But it's important to understand that if you're in the military, and you take great pride in serving in that military, then it seems to me if you've lost the war, and you've lost it in 6 days, it sends a message. And it's a message that's convulsive because it's not simply one generation. This is continued. You turn to Arab textbooks, and this becomes a source of humiliation. Now, it's true, and sometime, at some point, it will pass. It's one of the reasons why I've always, when people always ask me, what is the answer to the Middle East, I always say, in one word, patience. Maybe in a generation, maybe 2 generations, the world will look very different. But at the moment, it doesn't. And so, as I indicated to you, this Minister of Defense, who had been appointed by Sisi 2 years ago, he's a pretty intelligent guy. He did not have that memory of 67 the way I did. I'm a lot older than he is. But it seared his soul. It's something that was still there. And it's very much a part of the military culture in that country.
And we don't want to do the 73 war because we're finished here, but the Egyptians launched the 73 war, which I have to tell you, they also lost. I mean, if there's anything unclear about that, they lost the 73 war, but they told themselves that they won. And this goes exactly to your point, because they won because they crossed the Suez Canal back into the Sinai Desert. They told themselves they won, and only because they won could Sadat ultimately make peace with Israel. Because you have to erase the humiliation of 67. So we erased it in 73. No, they didn't. No, they didn't. They lost in 73 also. But that's not how they played it.
This will could have captured Cairo.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
If we're going to close on this, because Feel for Truth has 3 objectives. One is to educate people about Israel and the crises or accusations she faces today. 2 is to empower them with the skills to be effective advocates. And 3, as you kind of see indicative here, is to build a community, like-minded individuals, to have these kind of talks, to go to a bar and schmooze, to do all these different things within the community. So with that, from each of you, I'd like to hear, what does 1967 mean for us, for young professionals, and for who are going through an era, like the Second Intifada, for example, not great for the 67 era, the 48 era, but we counted people, not so much us anymore on campuses, but growing up today, what does 1967 mean?
I can tell you that I have a very good friend who was the Consul General in New York for Israel. And he did a poll that I found quite interesting. It was in the metropolitan area of New York, so to some degree, it's not all Jews, but a very sizable slice of the Jewish population. And he asked the question, how do you feel about Israel? And he said, in the past, he would get at least 3/4 of the population saying, I am pro-Israel. Today he gets 20% saying pro-Israel, 15% on the fence, not sure how they feel about it. Another 15-20% really don't care. And then he has some who are quite negative about Israel. The reason why 67 is so important, it was a moment of extraordinary pride that I felt in being a Jew and in being a Zionist. It was a great sense that Israel is here to stay. I believed very deeply that whatever modest contributions I could make to the state, I wanted to make, because Israel is going to make significant contributions to the world stage. Who would have thought that Israel is a nation of great warriors? One wouldn't have thought so until 67. So this sense of pride, I think, is a very important part of why understanding the 67 war and thinking of it as celebratory, as I said before, is so important.
I would only add that the week before that, though, you understood, at least my greatest feeling was, it could all be lost.
That's true.
It could all be lost. And one of the things that we as Jews know is you have great highs and you have great lows in our history. never forget that before that great high and the pride and all those things that we remember from that was terror, that it could all disappear. So we, as this generation of Jews, have to try to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
On that note,
That's a down note.
well, that's a very and really, of all the anniversaries this year, 1917, 47, last boot camp, I asked this question at nauseam, right? What are the anniversaries this year? 1897, 1917, 47, 67, 67 perhaps most celebratory. It's very good notes. Jen?
Thank you. And as a small token of appreciation, these are Build for Truth pins for the both
cool.
of you. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have you guys again. Everyone's invited to join us now next door at the bar. And also, if you haven't done boot camp, we have applications out.
Sorry, you can't
Apply